think Russia is only about vodka, bears, and the Kremlin. Wait until you find out about their gender imbalance crisis that's reshaping society, laws that make decorating Easter eggs a criminal offense, and indigenous tribes living in the coldest inhabited places on Earth. These aren't your typical Russia facts. These are the secrets locals know but tourists never discover. Number 10. Russia has one of the world's most extreme gender imbalances, and it's getting worse. Picture walking through any Russian city and noticing something unusual about the crowds around you. Look closer at the faces passing by, especially among older generations, and you'll realize women dramatically outnumber men. This isn't your imagination. Russia has a staggering gender gap with only 86 males for every 100 females, making it the country with the highest number of excess females in the entire world at over 10.4 million more women than men. You heard right. Russia has more missing men than any other nation on the planet. Here's where it gets really interesting. While most countries have relatively balanced gender ratios, Russia's imbalance has deep historical roots stretching back to World War II, when millions of Soviet men died in battle. But wait, that was 80 years ago. Why hasn't the ratio corrected itself? The answer is both tragic and shocking. Russian men continue to die at alarming rates from preventable causes. The life expectancy gap between Russian men and women stands at over 11 years, with women expected to live to 75.6 years, while men only reach 64.2 years on average. Only war-torn Syria has a higher gender gap in life expectancy. What's killing Russian men at such unprecedented rates? The primary culprit is alcohol, particularly vodka. A comprehensive study in the Lancet Medical Journal found that excess vodka consumption is responsible for a disproportionate number of deaths among Russian men, with young men particularly vulnerable to alcohol-related incidents, accidents, and diseases. Picture this. While 52% of Russian women believe drinking alcohol is morally unacceptable, only 36% of Russian men share this view. This cultural divide literally costs lives. Think about the ripple effects of having 10.4 million more women than men. In Moscow and St. Petersburg, dating becomes a mathematical nightmare for women who vastly outnumber potential male partners. Women are taught from a young age that they'll have to compete fiercely for male attention, treating men as a limited resource. This creates intense social pressure and anxiety that shapes everything from fashion choices to career decisions. On dating websites like Mamba.ru, Russia's most popular platform, 60% of users are male, but this doesn't reflect the real-world gender ratio, just the desperation of the available men seeking relationships online. The situation has only gotten worse since 2022. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has killed over 120,000 Russian men, widening the gender gap even further. Demographers warn that this imbalance creates social tension, widespread male frustration, and even gives rise to incel movements. For women, despite having numerical advantage, the traditional pressure to marry and the perception of men as scarce creates mental health challenges and hinders female solidarity. Russia isn't just dealing with a population crisis, it's living through a gender apocalypse that touches every aspect of society. Number 9. In Russia, decorating Easter eggs with the wrong message can land you in jail. Imagine you're a kindergarten teacher planning a fun Easter egg decorating activity with colorful designs for children to discover. Sounds innocent enough, right? Well, in Russia, this wholesome activity can transform into a criminal offense faster than you can say political dissent. A former nursery school teacher in Russia learned this the hard way when she was convicted and faced legal consequences for decorating Easter eggs with a political slogan supporting an opposition activist. You heard right. Painting eggs led to a criminal conviction. Here's the scary part. She wasn't even protesting illegally. The teacher decorated these eggs in a designated free speech zone of a public park, a section supposedly protected for political expression, but Russian authorities charged her with participating in an illegal demonstration anyway. Think about that for a moment. Even in areas explicitly designated for free speech, Russians can be prosecuted for expressing political opinions through something as harmless as Easter egg art. This isn't some outdated Soviet-era law either. These prosecutions happen regularly in modern Russia. The rabbit hole goes even deeper. Russia's anti-extremism laws have become so broad and vague that virtually any form of expression can be deemed criminal if authorities decide it threatens social discord. The language of these laws includes provisions against inciting social discord and inciting religious discord that can be interpreted to criminalize trade union activities, religious proselytizing, and even provocative social media comments. One Russian teacher in Oriol was convicted of inciting ethnic hatred for writing a poem and received 300 hours of community service plus termination from his teaching position. His crime: poetry that authorities deemed inflammatory. Wait until you find out about the surveillance apparatus backing these prosecutions. Since 2012, Russia has intensified its crackdown on freedom of expression, selectively labeling government criticism as threats to state security. The government has implemented invasive surveillance of online activities, monitoring citizens' internet usage to identify potential extremists. Simply reposting content from accounts labeled as foreign agents without including the proper disclaimer can result in criminal charges, fines of 100,000 rubles, that's about $1,000, or even imprisonment. Picture living in a society where you must constantly self-censor, even during holiday celebrations. Russians have learned to avoid political discussions on social media, carefully screen their decorations and artwork for potentially offensive content, and think twice before expressing opinions even in supposedly protected spaces. The chilling effect is intentional. When a grandmother can't safely paint an Easter egg with a political message, when a teacher loses their job over a poem, the message is clear. Any form of dissent, no matter how creative or peaceful, carries serious risks. This is Russia's reality, where the line between celebration and criminalization is terrifyingly thin. Number 8. Russia's indigenous Nenets people migrate over 1,000 kilometers annually with reindeer across the Arctic, living at temperatures that would kill most humans. Close your eyes and imagine the most extreme living conditions possible. Temperatures plummeting to minus 50 degrees Celsius, endless white tundra stretching in every direction, polar nights lasting months where the sun never rises, and ice covering the ground for most of the year. Now, imagine not just surviving in these conditions but thriving there for over 1,000 years. This is the reality for the Nenets people, one of Russia's most fascinating indigenous tribes who live in the Yamal Peninsula, far above the Arctic Circle, in a region they call the end of the world. The Nenets are true nomads who undertake one of the world's last great migrations. Every single year, these reindeer herders travel up to 1,000 kilometers along ancient migration routes, moving with herds numbering in the thousands. During winter they prefer pastures in the southern taiga forests where temperatures are merely freezing. But when spring arrives, they begin their epic journey northward to the permafrost lands near the Kara Sea in Siberia. Picture traveling this distance on foot or by sled, living in portable tents called chums, with nothing but reindeer, dogs, and your family for company across some of Earth's most inhospitable terrain. Wait until you find out how few indigenous people like the Nenets remain in Russia. Of the more than 180 peoples inhabiting contemporary Russia, only 40 groups are officially recognized as indigenous, totaling around 260,000 people. Less than 0.2% of Russia's total population. The Nenets are among the largest of these groups with nearly 30,000 members, but even they face existential threats. Only 10% of Siberia's tribal people now live nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyles, compared to 70% just 30 years ago. The smallest recognized groups like the Nenets with only 350 people and the Oroks with 450 people, teeter on the edge of extinction. Here's what makes these indigenous people's survival even more remarkable and tragic. They inhabit approximately 2/3 of Russia's massive territory, despite representing only 0.2% of the population, and their lands sit atop some of the world's richest deposits of oil, gas, and minerals. Russian extraction companies have devastated much of the Khanty tribe's lands, with nickel mining intruding on reindeer pastures and sacred sites. There are currently 70 identified conflict zones between indigenous groups and extractive industry projects. In 2014, regional parliaments even weakened legislation that had required tribes' permission before companies could enter their land. Imagine watching bulldozers and oil rigs destroy the migration routes your ancestors traveled for millennia while having zero legal power to stop them. The indigenous peoples practice animism, believing that spirits inhabit animals, plants, and natural phenomena like the sun, moon, water, and fire. Shamans within these communities hold enormous power, often more influence than tribal leaders, performing rituals with drumming and dancing in trance states induced by herbs. These shamans serve as healers, spiritual guides, and keepers of ancient knowledge about surviving in the Arctic. But this traditional knowledge is vanishing rapidly. Since 2002, the population of 24 Russian indigenous groups has declined, with at least 16 peoples considered endangered and 11 already declared extinct. Russia has no concept of free, prior, and informed consent in its legislation, meaning these communities have no legal right to refuse development projects on their ancestral lands. Think about the resilience required to maintain this lifestyle in the 21st century. While Moscow residents worry about internet speeds and traffic, the Nenets navigate by stars and animal tracks, build shelters from reindeer hides that can withstand Arctic gales, and preserve a way of life that existed long before Russia itself. They've survived Stalin's collectivization, Soviet-era forced settlements, and now face climate change melting their permafrost hunting grounds. Yet every spring, they pack up their chums and begin that ancient journey north with their reindeer, keeping alive one of humanity's oldest nomadic traditions in the face of modernity's relentless advance. Number 7. Playing Pokemon Go inside a Russian church can get you arrested, and people have actually been prosecuted for it. So, just picture this scenario. You're walking through Yekaterinburg, your phone buzzes with a rare Pokemon nearby, you follow the signal, and it leads you inside a beautiful historic church. You enter, open Pokemon Go, and start playing while maybe even chanting some playful game-related phrases. Congratulations, in Russia, you've just committed a crime. Sounds unbelievable. But Russian authorities have actually arrested people for exactly this scenario, charging them with using the game to make political statements or raise awareness in religious buildings. You heard right. Catching virtual creatures in a church isn't just frowned upon, it's literally illegal. The Pokemon Go incident reveals something much deeper and, honestly, more disturbing about Russian society: the government's obsession with controlling seemingly harmless activities that might somehow threaten state authority. Russia has created an entire ecosystem of bizarre bans on everyday items and activities that would seem perfectly normal in Western countries. For example, yoga studios in the city of Nizhnevertovsk received official cease and desist letters in 2015 because authorities deemed yoga a method of spreading new religious cults. The irony? Russia co-sponsored International Yoga Day at the United Nations, and Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev himself practices yoga. So yoga is simultaneously banned locally but promoted internationally by the same government. Wait until you find out what else Russia has criminalized. Since 2014, swearing in public spaces is illegal and subject to fines for both individuals and organizations. Books containing curse words must carry warning labels like cigarette packages. The professional networking site LinkedIn was completely banned in Russia in 2016 because it stores user data on servers outside Russia. The government wants all data stored within Russian borders for easy access and surveillance. Even showing ID when asked can land you in trouble. Failing to present identification in crowded places like subways or public squares, particularly if you're a migrant worker, results in immediate detention and a trip to the police station. Here's the kicker about Russia's laws: they're so vague and selectively enforced that literally any behavior can become criminal if authorities decide to target you. The anti-extremism legislation defines extremism so broadly that prosecutors have near unlimited discretion. Making memes critical of the government? Arrested. Sharing posts from accounts labeled foreign agents without proper disclaimers? Criminal charges. Attending a peaceful protest without permission? Up to 15 days detention for a first offense, and prison sentences of up to 5 years for 3 violations. In 2024 alone, Russian authorities made 1,185 arrests at rallies and protests. Think about the psychological toll of living under such arbitrary enforcement. Russians must constantly evaluate whether ordinary activities might somehow be interpreted as political statements. Is this social media post too critical? Could this book club discussion be deemed extremist? Will playing a mobile game in the wrong location land me in jail? The Pokemon Go prosecution wasn't really about the game. It was about sending a message that authorities can criminalize anything, anywhere, anytime, if they perceive a threat to state control. One moment you're enjoying a globally popular mobile game, the next you're facing charges for making a political statement. In Russia, the line between gaming and going to jail is one wrong Pokestop away. Number 6. Russia banned an entire international LGBT movement that doesn't actually exist, creating legal chaos and fear. Imagine being prosecuted for participating in an organization that literally doesn't exist. Sounds like something from a dystopian novel, right? Well, in November 2023, Russia's Supreme Court declared the international LGBT movement an extremist organization and banned it entirely. Here's the problem. There is no such thing as an organized international LGBT movement. It's not a registered organization. It has no leadership structure, no membership cards, no headquarters. It simply doesn't exist as an entity that can be banned. Yet this fictional designation now makes virtually any LGBT-related activity in Russia a criminal offense, punishable with lengthy prison sentences. The implications of banning a non-existent organization are both brilliant and terrifying from an authoritarian perspective. Because there's no actual organization to define, Russian prosecutors can now label anything LGBT-related as part of this extremist movement. A pride flag? Extremism. A social media post supporting LGBT rights. Membership in a banned organization. Two people of the same gender kissing in public. Propaganda for an extremist group. In August 2024, a court in Moscow fined a local resident 100,000 rubles, which is about $1,000, for LGBT propaganda over an old social media post showing same-sex people kissing. A bar in Krasnoyarsk staging drag performances received a 450,000 ruble, or $4,900, fine just for allowing same-sex visitors to hug and kiss on their premises. Wait until you find out how far Russia has taken this crusade. In July 2023, Russia passed comprehensive legislation that banned gender-affirming surgeries completely, dissolved marriages of transgender people, prohibited changing gender markers on official documents, barred trans people from adopting or taking guardianship of children, and even allowed coercive medical interventions on intersex children. Russia's media regulator, Roskomnadzor, prosecutes streaming services for showing movies featuring LGBT people and orders the blocking of any websites with LGBT content. Publishers have recalled books with LGBT characters. A bookstore in Nizhny Novgorod was fined 500,000 rubles, or $5,000, simply for selling a novel that included depictions of same-sex relationships. The foreign agent label makes everything worse. Under Russian law, any individual or organization receiving foreign funding and engaging in political activities, which includes human rights work, gets designated as a foreign agent. This label requires constant disclaimers on all publications and social media posts, subjects people to invasive audits, and carries heavy stigma. In 2024 alone, Russia designated 150 new people and entities as foreign agents, bringing the total to 901. In June 2024, authorities announced they had identified 45 people for criminal prosecution for failing to properly label their content as coming from a foreign agent, with 25 criminal cases already opened. One coordinator faced pre-trial detention simply for not including the disclaimer on social media posts. Here's the scary part. Chechnya, a region within Russia, represents the most extreme persecution of LGBT people. Authorities have tortured LGBT individuals, with at least 2 men held as suspects being tortured and recordings of their torture publicly shared. A 2017 UN panel of experts condemned waves of torture and killings of gay men in Chechnya. In February 2024, authorities arrested a man who had previously been tortured in Chechnya for his presumed sexual orientation, transferring him back to Chechnya, where police refused to disclose his whereabouts. Videos later appeared showing him at home making statements that clearly appeared forcibly extracted. Think about living as an LGBT person in Russia today. You can't marry, you can't adopt children, you can't change your legal documents to match your identity, and you can't express yourself openly without risking massive fines or imprisonment. Hospitals turn away transgender patients. Schools fire teachers suspected of being LGBT. Bars close for allowing same-sex couples to show affection. And, hanging over everything, is the specter of that extremist organization charge, a legal fiction that can be applied to literally anyone at any time. Russia has effectively criminalized an identity by banning an organization that never existed, creating a legal Kafka trap where the absence of evidence becomes the evidence itself. Number 5. Russian food prices are skyrocketing so fast that potatoes cost 73% more than at the start of 2024, and butter is now a luxury item. Picture a 72-year-old Russian pensioner named Tatiana from Kirov spending 2/3 of her monthly pension on food, up from about half just a year ago. She's had to completely stop buying exotic fruits, and for the first time since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, she can't afford the traditional New Year's dish of red caviar that her family has enjoyed for decades. This isn't a story about a struggling family in Moscow. This is the new reality for millions of Russians as food prices spiral completely out of control. creating a crisis that even concerns the Kremlin. Here are the shocking numbers that reveal just how bad the situation has become. A kilogram of potatoes, one of Russia's most basic staples, is at least 73% more expensive than at the start of 2024. The price of butter has increased by more than 30% in a single year. Vegetables like onions and beets have jumped over 20%. Sour cream, milk, bread, and fish are all 12 to 15% higher than 2023 levels. These aren't luxury items or imported goods. These are the fundamental ingredients of Russian cuisine that every household needs. Families are literally making choices between bread and butter, unable to afford both. Wait until you find out what's driving these insane price increases. The Bank of Russia has raised interest rates to a record high of 21%, trying to cool down inflation, but food price inflation remained above 9% in October 2024, with overall inflation expected to hit 8.5% for the year. The central bank even admits that the balance of inflation risks is still significantly tilted to the upside, meaning prices will likely keep climbing. Multiple factors are colliding simultaneously. Russia's war in Ukraine has drawn workers from every industry into military service, with agriculture particularly devastated by an estimated shortage of 200,000 farm laborers. The ruble's dramatic weakening has made imported products scarce, and expensive, war-related sanctions have disrupted traditional supply chains, causing some imported products to become almost impossible to find. The ripple effects extend far beyond grocery bills. Russia's average monthly wage stands at 86,339 rubles, or about $950, but this varies wildly by region. In Ingushetia, the average drops to just 38,931 rubles, or about $430. The minimum wage is approximately $212.6 per month, which isn't staggeringly low by developing world standards, but definitely isn't enough to cover basic needs when food prices are jumping 10 to 70% annually. Mortgage rates have soared to 30% at some banks, making home ownership impossible for young Russians. The median rent per square meter increased by 17.3% in 2024 alone. In Moscow, a one-bedroom apartment in the city center costs 70,000 to 150,000 rubles monthly, essentially requiring your entire salary just for housing. Here's where it gets political. President Putin was inundated with complaints about food prices during a citizen call-in event in late 2023, and as the situation has worsened, officials from the Ministry of Agriculture to the Prosecutor General's office are desperately trying to figure out how to bring prices under control. One analyst explains that the main tool of the authorities is force. The government has extensive experience forcing producers and retail chains to adjust prices through intimidation. But this forceful pressure isn't highly effective or provides only temporary relief. You can threaten grocery stores all you want, but when the fundamental economic problems, labor shortages, sanctions, currency collapse, war spending, remain unsolved, prices inevitably keep climbing. Think about what this means for ordinary Russians. A country that once prided itself on affordable food staples now sees citizens rationing potatoes and treating butter like a luxury item reserved for special occasions. Students who could once live on $150 to $300 monthly for groceries now struggle with bills approaching $400 to $500. Families skip meals or switch to the cheapest possible ingredients. The traditional New Year's feast, Russia's most important holiday celebration, becomes an impossible dream for pensioners and working-class families. All while the government spends billions on military operations and oligarchs display obscene wealth. Russia isn't just facing inflation, it's experiencing a full-scale crisis of affordability that threatens the social contract between the state and its citizens. When people can't afford potatoes, revolution isn't far behind. Number 4. Russian women outlive men by 11 years. But this advantage creates a dating nightmare and social crisis. Imagine a society where women face a bizarre paradox. They dramatically outnumber men and live significantly longer, yet this numerical advantage creates crushing social pressure, anxiety, and a desperate competition for male attention. This is modern Russia, where women outlive men by an astonishing 11.4 years on average, one of the highest gender life expectancy gaps in the entire world, exceeded only by war-torn Syria. Russian women born between 2010 and 2015 can expect to reach age 75.6, while men only make it to 64.2 years. Let that sink in. Russian men die more than a decade earlier than women, creating a society where widowhood and male scarcity define female experience. The origins of this gap trace back to the Soviet period, but the situation has actually worsened in recent decades. In the 1960s, male mortality began rising dramatically in all socialist countries, while female mortality remained stable or rose much more slowly. A British study from 1996 found that the difference between Eastern European and Western European mortality rates was primarily behavioral. Men in socialist bloc countries had particularly high rates of neglecting personal health, along with severe alcohol and tobacco addiction. These destructive patterns became absorbed into the culture and lifestyle of post-Soviet nations and continue affecting them today. Demographers note that overcoming these behavioral models requires 30 to 40 years at minimum. They're not easily changed. Wait until you find out the specific causes killing Russian men at such alarming rates. Working-age Russian men are 6 times more likely to die from external causes, accidents, suicides, alcohol poisoning, and violence, compared to working-age women. Alcoholism remains the top killer, with vodka consumption alone responsible for a disproportionate number of male deaths, according to research published in The Lancet. But it's not just drinking. Russian men smoke at much higher rates than women, work more dangerous jobs, seek medical care less frequently, and engage in riskier behaviors across the board. The societal conditions driving these behaviors include limited opportunities for social mobility, low quality of life, and crushing stress that leads men to adopt destructive coping mechanisms. Here's where the situation becomes truly dystopian. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has killed over 120,000 additional men since 2022, further widening an already severe gender gap. The 2020 census found women made up about 54% of Russia's population, but this percentage has almost certainly increased as the war grinds on. Partial mobilization in September 2022 triggered a mass exodus of young men fleeing conscription. Google search interest in how to leave Russia spiked dramatically overnight. Those men who remain face not only the existing health crisis, but now the very real possibility of being sent to war, where survival odds are grim. Think about how this shapes women's lives in ways that seem beneficial, but are actually devastating. Contemporary Russian society puts less social pressure on women to start families quickly compared to previous generations, but the demographic imbalance still creates major challenges. Girls learn from a young age that they must compete fiercely for male attention, treating men as a limited resource to be fought over. This competition mentality generates increased anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues. At the societal level, it hinders cooperation and solidarity among women. Why help other women when they're your rivals for the same scarce men? Dating becomes a nightmare where women outnumber men but still face traditional expectations of marriage and motherhood. The male perspective is equally troubling. When massive gender imbalances exist, societies typically experience widespread social tension and frustration. Large numbers of young men unable to find partners often generates anger, resentment, and gives rise to incel movements and other toxic ideologies. Russian men who do remain in the dating pool find themselves with enormous leverage. They can be far more selective, demanding, and even abusive because they know women have fewer alternatives. The whole dynamic creates a race to the bottom, where both genders suffer. Men die young from preventable causes. Women live longer but in a society that views them as surplus, and everyone participates in a dating market shaped by scarcity, desperation, and deteriorating health. Russia's 11-year life expectancy gap isn't just a demographic statistic, it's a social catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. Number 3. Russia's foreign agent law has labeled over 900 people and organizations, and simply reposting their content without a disclaimer is a crime. Picture waking up one morning to discover you've been officially labeled a foreign agent by your government. Your bank accounts get audited, your social media posts require special disclaimers, people treat you with suspicion or avoid you entirely. Your ability to run for office, work certain jobs, or participate in public life evaporates overnight. And the reason? Maybe you received a small grant from an international foundation years ago. Maybe you criticized the government while accepting foreign donations for your non-profit. Maybe you just wrote articles authorities didn't like. Welcome to Russia's Foreign Agent Registry, a weapon of political repression disguised as a transparency law that has labeled over 900 individuals and organizations as threats to the state. Here's how this Kafkaesque system works in practice. Under legislation first introduced in 2012 and repeatedly expanded since, anyone receiving foreign funding while engaging in loosely defined political activities can be designated a foreign agent. The term carries enormous stigma in Russian. It implies traitor, spy, foreign puppet. Once labeled, you face crushing requirements. Every social media post, publication, or public statement must include a disclaimer identifying you as a foreign agent. Failure to include this disclaimer constitutes a crime. In 2024 alone, Russia designated 150 new people and entities as foreign agents, bringing the total to 901. In June 2024, authorities announced they had identified 45 people for criminal prosecution for failing to properly label their content, with 25 criminal cases already opened. Wait until you find out how broadly this law applies. In July 2024, the Justice Ministry issued the first known warnings to third parties who merely reposted content from foreign agents without including the required label. Think about that. You can face criminal charges just for sharing someone else's social media post if they've been designated a foreign agent, and you don't add a disclaimer. It's not enough to avoid being labeled yourself. You must actively police all content you interact with, constantly checking the registry to see who's been added, ensuring every repost includes the proper language. The law creates a surveillance state where citizens monitor themselves and each other. The political weaponization is blatant and shameless. In May 2024, Russia passed a law banning anyone labeled a foreign agent from running for any public office or serving on election commissions. Independent presidential contender Ekaterina Duntsova was designated a foreign agent after authorities prohibited her from running in March 2024 elections. Notice the timing. She's blocked from running, then labeled to ensure she can never run in the future. A Moscow municipal deputy named Pavel Ivanov was designated a foreign agent, immediately ending his bid for a seat in September Moscow local council elections. The label has become a tool to eliminate political opposition completely. Here's the truly terrifying part. The definition of political activities is so vague that, honestly, virtually any activity can qualify. Human rights work, political; environmental activism, political; election monitoring, political; educational programs, could be political; journalism, definitely political. In October 2024, a court in Moscow sentenced French researcher Laurent Vinatier to 39 months in prison on foreign agent charges. In October, law enforcement raided the apartment of Lev Schlossberg, opposition Yabloko party deputy chair, who faces criminal charges for repeatedly failing to mark his social media posts with the foreign agent label. These aren't hypothetical prosecutions. They're happening now, regularly, destroying lives and careers. Think about the chilling effect this creates on Russian civil society. Major human rights organizations have been forced to close. The Sakharov Center was fined 5 million rubles, about $50,000, and then forcibly closed following a Justice Ministry lawsuit. Memorial, Russia's oldest and most respected human rights organization, was liquidated. The Moscow-Helsinki Group, founded in 1976, was shuttered. Sova, a watchdog on Russian extremism, was closed. Dozens of other organizations have been banned as undesirable or forced to cease operations. The message is clear: challenge the government and you'll be labeled, fined, prosecuted, and destroyed. Russia has essentially created a modern version of Soviet-era persecution, where instead of calling dissidents enemies of the people, they're branded foreign agents. Different terminology, same authoritarian playbook, devastatingly effective in silencing opposition. Number 2. Russia officially recognizes 40 indigenous peoples, but gave them no right to refuse when industry destroys their land. Imagine your family has lived on the same land for over 1,000 years. Your ancestors are buried there. The rivers teem with fish. Your great-grandparents caught. The migration routes for reindeer herds have been traveled for countless generations. Now imagine massive mining corporations show up with bulldozers and drilling equipment, ready to extract billions of dollars worth of oil, gas, and minerals from beneath your home. You object, you protest, you point to laws supposedly protecting your rights, and the government responds, too bad. You have no legal right to say no. This is the reality for Russia's 40 officially recognized indigenous peoples, who inhabit approximately 2/3 of Russia's massive territory despite representing only 0.2% of the total population. Here's the fundamental problem. Russia has no concept of free, prior and informed consent enshrined in legislation. This international legal principle, recognized by the United Nations, states that indigenous peoples have the right to give or withhold consent before any project affecting their lands or resources proceeds. Russia explicitly rejects this principle. While the Russian constitution and national legislation mention rights for indigenous minority peoples of the north, the actual implementation of protective laws is rarely enforced and frequently overridden by government decisions regarding natural resource extraction. Translation: indigenous peoples have rights on paper that mean absolutely nothing in practice. Wait until you find out the scale of destruction happening right now. There are currently 70 identified conflict zones between indigenous communities and extractive industry projects across Russia. By 2013, oil and gas companies had already devastated much of the Khanty tribe's lands in western Siberia. In 2014, the Khanty-Mansi Regional Parliament deliberately weakened legislation that had previously required tribes' permission before companies could enter their land. They literally removed the one protection indigenous people had. Nornickel, the world's largest nickel producer, has been destroying Arctic environments and violating indigenous rights for decades, with nickel mining intruding on reindeer pastures and sacred sites. The company pursues a divide-and-rule strategy, pressuring local communities while creating its own indigenous council and luring communities with monetary incentives to support extraction projects. The demographic reality makes the situation even more desperate. Together, Russia's indigenous small-numbered peoples of the North, Siberia, and Far East number only about 260,000 people, less than 0.2% of Russia's population. The smallest groups include the Enets, with just 350 people, and the Oroks, with 450 people. At least 16 of these peoples have such small populations, they're considered endangered, and at least 11 have been declared extinct. The Karuk people are already gone. Since 2002, the population of 24 Russian indigenous groups has declined, with only 10 increasing in membership. This decline results from assimilation, loss of self-identification, and the complete destruction of traditional lifestyles that made these cultures viable. Here's the bureaucratic nightmare indigenous peoples face. In 2001, Russia passed a law on the territories of traditional nature use that was supposed to ensure indigenous land use rights to territories needed for subsistence. It sounded promising on paper. Want to know how many territories of traditional nature use have been established since this law went into effect? 0. Not a single one. The law exists, but the government has never actually implemented it.